Welcome to the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. This is Melinda Cole Klein. The North and the South had long been on a collision course. From the beginning of the Republic, the issue of lifetime bondage had signaled cultural and economic differences between the extractive South and the manufacturing North. By mid-century, differences between U.S. regions began to accelerate in type, while debates fell across ideological lines. Although both the North and South prospered economically in the 1850s, both claimed to see weaknesses in each other. The election of 1860 loomed on the minds of Americans. With the new Republican Party having done so well in the 1856 election and a fracturing Democratic Party, there became a four-way run for the presidency. In the end, Abraham Lincoln was able to get the electoral votes needed to be a clear winner. And due to the sectional politics and voting process dividing the nation at the time, Lincoln did not even appear on the ballot in 9 Southern states. Southerners saw this as an act of war. Southerners rallied for secession from the Union. As soon as the election results were announced, South Carolina began the process of seceding from the Union. They saw this election as unfair and dishonest. The men who voted for Lincoln never thought that the South would secede or that it would result in war lasting so long. Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president, did not believe either that Congress had the power or the right to end slavery. This was also a Southern position. While he was ambivalent to slavery, he believed the age-old labor system would end on its own, that no war was needed as industrialism gained more popularity and the West became safer for migrating Americans. In addition, most politicians believed a slower transition out of slavery, approximating about 20 years, such as the British did, when they mandated as a part to end slavery in their colonies. Former slaves became apprentices before working on their own. In the decades before the Civil War, Congress debated compensation for Southern slaveholders amounting to $3 billion for their loss of property. A peaceful resolution similar to that of the British government enacted in 1833 for their colonial plantation owners. The British Plan. Parliament had passed legislation that would, in time, pay out to slaveholders $20 million as compensation for their loss in property. This compensation plan was combined with a mandatory apprentice system for free British slaves. This program avoided labor shortages when freedom was granted. After the 7-year apprentice, former British slaves could migrate as they pleased. In America, Congress did not assist the Southern economy to ensure after freedom, labor shortages did not happen. This feature plagued the Southern economy for decades after the war because Southern blacks refused to accept wages for work they formerly did as slaves. After the war, typically the offer was made in kind, a system of exchange by way of the value of wages paid for in meals and housing arrangements. In time, sharecropping would offer former slaves an avenue to which they could work for themselves, though it did not lead to home ownership of private property and remained a cycle of debt. In sum, Congress did not follow or create a successful emancipation plan such as the British one, when transitioning from a slave economy where it existed in the South, as it was most prevalent there. The federal government desired the South to become an image of the North, a pluralistic, equal society with a free market economy to which former slave would receive wages or training or compensation. But this is not what happened. Congress, unlike British Parliament, would not compensate former slave owners for their loss in property. Southern politicians did not want to be required to end slavery, but wanted this choice to belong to Southern voters. Like President Lincoln, Jefferson Davis argued that Congress did not have the power to bring down their economy in the South. This was a states' right issue. Federal legislation would alter the Southern way of life and living. For this reason, while the South did lose the war, the issue of states' rights is still a political hot topic today. More or less federal power. From the beginning, President Lincoln stressed to keep the Union intact as a war goal, bridging gaps between the war Democrats, border states, and Republicans. Lincoln's war goals evolved and were separate from the causes of the war. In 1862, he added emancipation for blacks because it would weaken the Confederacy. Thousands of laborers would flee the South and undermine the Southern economy. By 1863, in the Gettysburg Address, President Lincoln tied together three issues as a war goal. Number one, keeping the Union together. Number two, preserving democracy. And number three, ending the practice of slavery that stood in direct opposition to a free labor market economy, as it needed free Americans to work for wages. South Carolina led the South in seceding first. The creation of an independent Confederate nation in defiance of the United States was the immediate cause of war. That is, South Carolina's secession triggered the war. Shortly after, 4 more states seceded, a message from the Southern point of view to the White House protesting Lincoln's call to invade the South. From the North's point of view, it was an attempt to defend the nation after it was attacked at Fort Sumter. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, believed that the nation's states' rights theory protected the rights of citizens against a tyrannical government, reminiscent of the American Revolution. Overall, before Fort Sumter, 7 Gulf states seceded from the Union on February 9, 1861. They had created their own constitution similar to the U.S. Constitution. One exception would be that it protected slavery and it protected states' rights as professed by some politicians for decades, fearing the power of a strong centralized government as advocated as necessary by New Englanders. Once sworn in by March 4, 1861, President Lincoln did not intend to invade the southern states, nor did he intend to end slavery where it existed, but advocated he would use force, if necessary, to maintain possession of federal property. Southern delegations arrived in Washington, D.C. They offered to pay for federal properties in the South and negotiate a peace treaty. The President rejected any negotiations with Confederate agents on the grounds that the Confederacy was not a legitimate government and that making any treaty with it would be recognizing the South as a sovereign state. Fort Sumter in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina, was one of the 3 remaining Federal forts located in Confederate territory. Against the advice of his cabinet, he was determined not to desert this Federal post, but to defend it. Under orders from Confederate President Jefferson Davis, Confederates bombarded the fort with artillery fire on April 12th, forcing the fort to surrender. Northerners reacted and rallied behind Lincoln. At this point, states were to send troops to preserve the Union. President Lincoln called for 74,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days. 4 states in the Upper South, Tennessee, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Virginia, declared their departure from the Union, thus joining the Confederacy. To reward Virginia, Richmond became the Confederate capital. For this war, unlike the Revolutionary War 80 years before, technology and strategies had changed. By 1835, the Colt, repeating pistol, and later the Winchester rifle proved effective in killing. Soldiers no longer had to fight in strict formation, but close to enemy fronts using hand-to-hand combat. Thirdly, cannons were better, and air balloons used by the Union commanders as endorsed by Lincoln from 1861 to 1863 offered telegraphic reconnaissance, support of Confederate troop movements and activities. Opening battles and stalemate, 1861 to 1862. From the start of the war, the South won victories like Bull Run, Manassas, Virginia, in July 1861. Northern spectators attended, expecting to witness a quick victory for Northern troops, but they were chased back as Northern troops retreated. But the North and South traded victories and losses that first year in Virginia and West Virginia. In time, the war opened to the west, the Mississippi River area, and south, while it continued in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. A quick victory did not come to either side by 1862, remembered with battles at Harper's Ferry, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. General McClellan and Lee fought at the Battle of Antietam. There were 123,000 casualties. This was fought near Sharpsburg, Maryland, and the Antietam Creek on September 17, 1862, the bloodiest single day in U.S. military history. General Lee's army could not advance further and returned to Virginia. Antietam is considered a victory by both sides. The Union saw it as a victory because it halted Lee's invasion of the North. After Antietam, President Lincoln announced his Emancipation Proclamation, freeing black slaves in Union states and territories, though not in the border states. Keep in mind the South saw Antietam as a victory as well, because General Lee's army was left unchallenged to move his forces south and regroup in Virginia. The North advocated the Southern army retreated instead of remaining in the area, but both sides incurred heavy casualties, and staying would not have been logical. Who won depends on your perspective of the events. The decisive year, 1863. In 1863, there were more bloody battles such as Gettysburg. All the while, Union forces near the Potomac River narrowly defeated Confederate Virginia forces. While the federal government stopped Confederate General Lee's advance north, both armies retreated and regrouped. For General Lee's second northern invasion, hoping to reach as far as Philadelphia, to which the goal was to influence northern politicians to give up and let the Southern states leave the Union in peace. The last stage, 1864 to 1865. The Confederate Army won many of the early battles of the Civil War. Unfortunately, the President and the Union Army underestimated how vibrant and skilled the Southern culture was. But this makes sense. In the honor-bound patriarchal society, male prowess reinforced a skill set of its men to protect society, which proves to be very useful in time of war, conflict, or internal disputes. In the industrial North, this was not the case. In addition, the North had munition factories while the Southern Confederacy did not, and bought their war necessities from European trade partners. However, by 1864, the South was losing, and foreign supplies dwindled, as it seemed to the British the Confederacy was not going to win after all. Lincoln and his generals believed only total war could bring the end to the fighting. This meant using classic battle tactics remembered as divide and conquer. This scorched earth policy allowed General Sherman to use his forces to begin a march from Chattanooga, making his way to Atlanta, the capital of Georgia, thus splitting the Confederacy in two and leaving little for returning soldiers to come home to. At this stage of the war, 1864, after leaving Atlanta burned and pillaged, Sherman's army marched laid waste to about 30% of Georgia farms in his march to the sea, burning and pillaging a 60-mile path wide. It should not be forgotten that across this war, unscrupulous Northern forces invaded the South, raped its women, stole millions of dollars worth of Southern property, sending it north as personal profit. Millions of dollars of cotton bales were burned so Southerners could not use this commodity to sell for war supplies to foreign traders. Feminists such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony advocated in the press and in their public demonstrations, sometimes using violent and destructive means, for changes in regards to women's rights and equal justice for women, politically, economically, and socially. From the beginning of the war, women devoted themselves to helping by sewing shirts, knitting socks, providing medical supplies, and collecting food for troops. It would be during this war that American women found themselves a profession outside of teaching and midwifery. This would be nursing in hospital wards. First employed as a patent office clerk, Clara Barton, and a great-grandniece of the midwife Martha Ballard, came to the notice of the U.S. Medical Corps. Clara Barton had the ability to resolve logistical problems, such as making sure frontline hospitals had bandages and did not have to resort to using corn husks and were routinely in short supply. The proven abilities by Barton contributed to her value as she became a war nurse. In time, she would create a founding American institution, the Red Cross. Why would American women cross-dress as men and join the Confederate and Union armies? Some women, such as Confederate wife Loretta Janetta Vasquez, adopted a male persona to be near her husband. Thus, love and duty were her motivations, as she wrote in her wartime memoir, The Woman in Battle. For hundreds of other women, their aims were purely monetary, especially among poor Irish women. And some statistics claim, because of their sex was later revealed due to a doctor or nurse's treatment, this number ran as high as 400 such women in the Union Army. Cross-dressing women ran the risk of discovery if they became sick or wounded. For some women, such as Sarah Edwards or Elizabeth Van Lew, they served their country because they believed it was their patriotic duty. While both women wrote post-war memoirs of their experiences, historians are leery in regards to these records as authentic and truthful. Sarah Edmonds wrote Memoirs of a Soldier, Nurse, and Spy, a Woman's Adventures in the Union Army. In a recent publication, Bonnie Sue produced a popular history text that includes the prominent women who served in the Civil War. About 21 histories of women were included. This book is titled She Went to the Field: Women Soldiers of the Civil War. It was published in 2006. Each side had enormous costs to meet. Number 1, soldiers' wages. Number 2, medical supplies. Number 3, food and uniforms. Number 4, artillery and weapons. And then number 5 has to do with communication, administrative, and transportation costs. While the Union taxed import goods, it could not do much to raise money for the war. There are 3 ways to raise money for this purpose. Number 1, to print it. Number 2, to tax for it. And number 3, to borrow for it. The North and South took out loans with foreign nations and domestic loans as well. But it was the South that resorted to printing much-needed currency. They were in desperate need. They did not have one cannon factory. They were not industrialized, and borrowing money helped little. Catastrophic inflation in the South was almost immediate. By 1862, many civilians were out of money and needed silver or gold coins to buy food. Military developments during the American Civil War included Gatling guns, though little used, rifled muskets, the use of breech-loading weapons, repeating rifles, movable cannons, or otherwise known as flying artillery, along with air balloons, a French invention, ironclad ships and submarines, and the list goes on. The odds were certainly against the soldier during this conflict. Repeating rifles had been invented prior to the beginning of the war, but it was decided enlisted soldiers could not be trusted, and this would result in wasted ammunition. Therefore, instead of allowing enlisted men to use the repeating rifle, the War Department put its faith in the Springfield musket, in which a good soldier could fire 3 rounds in about a minute. Well into the war by 1863, Union officers would receive Army-issued repeating rifles, and then only the cavalry, not the enlisted foot soldier. It would be the Spencer repeating rifle that contributed to the beginning of the end of the war that would eventually lead to a Union victory. This allowed Northern troops to fire about 14 rounds per minute to the 3 rounds per minute allowed by a musket. Because ammunition was tightly controlled, Southerners did not find the new repeaters useful. About 200,000 Spencer rifles, historians have estimated, were provided to Union forces after 1863. The Gatling gun, designed in 1861, but Congress did not authorize this purchase because they were heavy, difficult to use, difficult to set up, and also move. After this weaponry was purchased from ammunition factories, it was infrequently used. The machine gun developed in the 1880s would succeed this technology. a vast improvement over the Gatling gun. European alliances, official or not, with the Confederacy shared economic and social ties. Throughout the early years of this war, the British Foreign Secretary, Napoleon III of France, and the British Prime Minister recognized that if they supported the Confederacy, this would undermine the Union war efforts and lead to the fall of the Republic of the United States. After the war with Napoleon Bonaparte, 1815, followed by the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, European politicians were divided on the success of the very young American Republic. European interests came to agree that to support the Confederacy would be best for trade, commerce, and world economic endeavors in general. As Confederate forces won many of the early battles, European interest grew in supporting a divided America as a result of this war and perhaps colonial rule for the North by Britain. When British importers faced a shortage of raw cotton from America during the Civil War, they turned their attentions to Egyptian and Indian cotton imports. Keep in mind the American Civil War created British employment for iron workers, producing weapons and cannons, both for Union and Confederate buyers. Additionally, British partners built Confederate ships to wage war, and British merchants assisted in running guns to the Confederacy as the U.S. Navy had blockaded southern ports. This northern strategy stymied southern trade. To make matters worse for the U.S. Navy, since the federal government did not have enough ships to manage such a large blockade on their own, the Royal British Navy assisted. British loyalties to the Confederates in southern ports sometimes furthered the Southern cause. While Britain and France cried neutrality unofficially, the Confederacy gained support and funds from European countries that believed in their culture and economy, sympathizing with a class-based society in which heritage and birth mattered. In addition, the British government would have jumped at the chance to reclaim Union territories, allowing the Confederacy to remain a republic and independent. All the while, when America was distracted with their own internal war, France attacked Mexico. With a French lead, European interests including Britain, France, Austria, and Spain justified a military action because Mexico had defaulted on their foreign loans. However, it would be France that invaded Mexico, to which other European nations were not interested, as this would likely bring war in time with the United States under the principles and legality of the Monroe Doctrine. However, the French had long been interested in acquiring former colonial territories on the American continent. France was not stopped completely in 1862 at the Battle of Puebla, so often celebrated in the United States as a total victory for Mexico against the French, known as Cinco de Mayo. In 1864 to 1867, France's Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, along with a group of Mexican revolutionaries, sent Maximilian I of Austria to become the Emperor of Mexico, in order that he would rule over them. Sadly for Maximilian, he was executed by Mexican revolutionaries. The U.S. and other nations refused to recognize this as a political coup. For a time, until the Mexican election of Benito Juarez and his government's rise to power, France and Austria ruled Mexico. Early in the war, President Lincoln had enacted a naval blockade of the Southern Confederacy to stop Southern trade with Europe or in efforts to receive supplies and perhaps fresh troops. Although few naval battles were fought and few men were killed, the blockade weakened the Southern economy. Some British investors built for the Confederacy very fast blockade runners and sold the South much-needed military supplies along with civilian luxuries that were sent in from Cuba and the Bahamas. In exchange, European nations supported the Confederacy bought cotton and tobacco. Significance of the ironclads. On her maiden voyage, CSS Virginia's easily sank the blockade ship USS Cumberland and destroyed the USS Congress. This was the sailing ships. But ironclads USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia battled in March 1862 with no clear win. American Civil War battles, especially naval battles using ironclads, shifted the technology of combat. Newer vessel types outclassed older sailing ships. In addition, submarines advanced warfare too. Nations such as France and England quickly realized, with the introduction and success of ironclads, that newly crafted frigates, small iron-hulled ships, were clearly inadequate with the low-lying American type of metal battleship. While the French and English did introduce a line of iron frigates, they were not steam-powered. The first use of steam-powered ironclads in combat was in the American Civil War. During the 1860s, the French, Dutch, British, and Spanish developed ironclad battleships. Over the course of the American Civil War, between 618 and 633,000 soldiers would die between 1861 and 1865. There are two significant causes to this large loss of life. Number one, military fighting styles and the use of armor as bulletproofing materials did not keep up with the capacity of firearms to kill more effectively. Number two, disease killed 2/3 of men in camps or injured during battle. This resulted from poor sanitation and close quarters, such as developing smallpox, dysentery, measles, typhoid, cholera, or scarlet fever. While it was easier to kill in this troop war, more military combatants and civilians died from disease. In particular, communicable diseases originating from camp life. Combatants died of simple wounds, quickly became infected because of medical practices and hospital conditions. Little was known about bacteria and how it spread. The camps in the Civil War in which the soldiers lived by today's standards were filthy, and this fact of life led directly to disease and oftentimes death. In several cases, dysentery occurred from drinking local water supplies. Beer would have been safer, and thousands died from this disease. When the soldier was not in camp, he was marching or in battle. The tactics used by the leaders during the war were the main cause for the high casualty lists, while diet affected soldiers' lives on both sides of the war. Both Union and Confederate prison camps experienced elements of disease, cases of starvation and death as well. Early in the war, prisoner exchange was common, but this changed when the Confederacy passed a law that any black captured in a Union uniform would be sold into slavery, while any white officer commanding black Union troops would be shot. The most notorious camp was the Confederate POW camp at Andersonville, Georgia. During the war, 41,000 prisoners were received at Andersonville. Out of these, 12,913 died. It was built to house only 10,000. High death rates attributed to massive overcrowding conditions combined with food shortages and the lack of fresh water. Keep in mind, there were no sanitation facilities. What do I mean by this? Well, there were no toilets. Fought in and around the town of Gettysburg, Virginia, most historians consider this as one of the bloodiest battles of the American Civil War and also a turning point. Between 46,000 and 51,000 Americans were casualties in a 3-day battle. That November, President Lincoln used the dedication ceremony for his delivery of the Gettysburg Address. This was held at the Gettysburg National Cemetery to honor the Union dead. The President also used this moment to reflect on this historic time. In the aftermath of the battle, the stench of rotting bodies made by thousands made townspeople violently ill in the weeks following the battle, and the burial of the dead in a dignified and orderly manner became a high priority for the few thousand residents of Gettysburg. It was here in Gettysburg President Lincoln put the finishing touches on the speech that he drafted in Washington. During his first term in office as President of the United States, Lincoln faced serious political challenges. At the time, Congress stymied the efforts for demands to increase certain powers of the federal government needed in this war, and this group blocked the president's emancipation policies. First came from a splinter group within the Democratic Party, known as the Peace Democrats. These politicians argued for a truce with the Southern Confederacy instead of a common approach, which was to exterminate the South at all costs. The Peace Democrats implied in their pleas to Congress a truce would end the war quickly. In addition, it would avoid the impending social revolution by emancipating 4 million African slaves. This re-election campaign for President Lincoln was difficult by 1864. The country wanted peace at any cost. Not only did the president need to convince the nation he would bring an end to the war, but he was the right choice as president during Southern Reconstruction, which Lincoln had laid out that would take only 2 years to complete. During the height of the campaign year, Atlanta fell under General Sherman's infamous 60-mile burn and destroy march to the sea. Sherman had effectively cut the South in half by destroying millions of dollars worth of Southern property and supplies through his scorched earth policy, which crippled the South. Then, within the Republican Party, the radical Republicans opposed his re-election because the president was viewed as soft and accommodating to Southerners and their readmission to the Union. To resolve this split in the Republican Party, like-minded Republicans and Democrats formed a short-lived political alliance. This is remembered as the National Union Party for this election. For his running mate, President Lincoln chose Democrat Senator Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, a border state, a wise move that resolved ideological differences. Meanwhile, Democrats nominated former commander of the Army, George B. McClellan. As the Democrats wanted to find an easy arrival, or at least a seemingly good truce, with the Confederates and end the war in this manner, their campaign slogan is remembered as, quote, "Peace without victory," end of quote. Lincoln would achieve a 55% majority in the popular vote. He helped to bolster voting in his favor while granting leaves to military personnel. This allowed thousands to vote for him in the election. While this popular vote was about half of the nation, President Lincoln was able to accumulate 212 out of the needed 233 electoral votes to become president for another term. Victory was his. The New York draft riots in New York City, taking place from July 13th to July 16th, 1863, were examples of the volatility of the immigrant population that sat against the war. In Abraham Lincoln's Enrollment Act of Conscription, the government planned to draft men as new recruits. Thousands of rioters filled the New York streets. Nonetheless, Congress passed the draft, authorizing the president to recruit the army whenever necessary. Generally speaking, most Irish-born earned low wages because of their social standing in the labor pool. To poor immigrants, more ex-slaves added to the labor pool threatened the stability of low wages in general. The draft was designed to spur voluntary enlistment. By the way, free blacks and Native Americans were not considered citizens, so they were excluded from the draft by design. White wage laborers compared their value to that of Southern slaves, stating that, quote, "We are sold for $300, the price of exemption from the war service, whilst they pay $1,000 for Negroes," end of quote. On Monday, July 13th, 1863, between 6 and 7 a.m., the 5 days of mayhem and bloodshed that would be known as the Civil War draft riots began. Police action and intervention by federal troops. The New York police forces could not stop the riots. Police were outnumbered. City control was not established until the arrival of federal troops from New York, Michigan, Indiana, and Maryland after a forced march. In addition, the New York governor called up the regiments of the state militia. By the morning of the 16th, there were nearly 4,000 federal troops in the city, and the riot subsided. By April 9, 1865, the war had ended. Both sides terminated fighting in a meeting held at the Appomattox Courthouse. The American Civil War began with high hopes and high ideals on both sides. In the North and South, thousands of men eagerly enlisted in local regiments and went off to war. In only 4 years, 600,000 or so Americans were dead, and many more were maimed and traumatized for life. Hundreds of thousands of women lost fathers, sons, brothers, and were never able to marry after the war. After all, if a husband was lost, able-bodied men were in short supply. It is important to remember that Lincoln, from the beginning of the war, made it clear that the North was fighting the war to preserve the Union, not to abolish slavery. Freeing the slaves was, from 1862, a war measure intended to weaken the rebelling South by destroying the economic base of its leadership class, because slaves were expected to run away as their northern counterparts were free under federal law. These factors, along with advances in military weapons and availability of medical and artillery supplies, The North enjoyed factors that would contribute to their victory. While the war strengthened the Northern economy, it undermined the Southern economy and affected international trade and commerce.